Detroit Become Human is one of the most beautiful games I've played yet this generation. But in our initial video, we only got a chance to really look deeply at the PS4 Pro version. So today, we're going to sit back and discuss some of the tech behind the game as well as how it stacks up on both the base and Pro consoles. And to do that, I am joined by Richard Ledbetter.
Hello there, John. How are you doing?
Not too bad. You ready to talk about some Detroit? Because I think with that video I just released, there is a lot to talk about here.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you have me at a disadvantage because I have only played the demo, and I have done so on the base unit and the Pro. There were some interesting differences there, but I was kind of surprised, and at the same time not surprised, by how close the base and the Pro versions actually are.
Yeah, in terms of the visual makeup, it's clear to me that the game was obviously targeting the base system, but there are some noticeable differences. But I think the first thing I want to touch on actually is the biggest difference, and that's performance. Performance isn't quite equal, and in fact, there are a lot of scenes where the base system drops well below the 30 FPS target for an extended period of time, which was a little surprising to me, honestly.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Obviously, the demo is only a very small sort of contained scene with only one, again, very small outdoor area. So the actual material we had for testing was very limited, but even there you could see that there were some stress points that the Pro handled pretty well, that the base unit was kind of buckling a bit more, and also there seemed to be minor streaming issues that would resolve in a bit more stutter on the base system. But, by and large, I was really surprised at how close they were.
So yeah, you're right. The smaller sequences and things like that, there are definitely dips on the base PS4, but in general it's not bad. But Detroit does feature a number of larger scale scenes, often with a lot of character models, like 40, 50, 60 plus models on screen at once in some of the largest scenes. And these are the sequences where I found the base system just kind of didn't really hold up that well. Like, for instance, this city section, this is right at the beginning of the game, and it isn't even a huge crowd, but there's enough people on screen and the space is large enough that the base system kind of hangs around 25 frames per second throughout the entire scene, which doesn't feel great. Whereas on the Pro, it's mostly a locked 30 FPS with just an occasional duplicate frame here and there, but overall it's a very smooth experience. But when you couple the extra stuttering that you sort of encounter on the base system with these significant dips in these large areas, it does kind of feel strange, like it kind of takes away from the polish of the experience, and it sort of harkens back to some of the issues I had with Heavy Rain, although without the screen tearing at least.
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, it's a big improvement. But I think the bottom line here is that, this is, and we're kind of highlighting this to begin with, this is the biggest difference between the base and the Pro systems. Otherwise, it's a much more consistent ride between the two platforms in other areas of the presentation.
Yeah, that's for sure. I think the main difference here comes down to the resolution of the game itself and then the resolution of the various effects used within. So, at its core then, it's a 1080p game on the base system, and it is a checkerboard 4K on PS4 Pro, but I say that with sort of an asterisk, because the post-processing pipeline is rendered prior to resolving the checkerboard, which means it only has to handle half of the number of pixels. And since the post-processing itself is already rendered at a lower resolution, that saves a lot on memory bandwidth and GPU resources.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's actually kind of cut down in two ways then. First of all, there is effectively half the native resolution. And within that kind of cut down resolution, there's also lower precision render targets there.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Things like the screen space reflections, for instance, are rendered at a much lower resolution on both systems. And of course, it benefits from the lower resolve on PS4 Pro as well. But another thing about that that's interesting that may help explain some of the performance differences is that a number of the shaders are apparently taking advantage of FP16 or half precision floating point numbers.
Right, okay, so let's put that into context. This is a specific hardware feature on PlayStation 4 Pro imported from AMD's Vega architecture. And as I understand it, it allows for FP16 to be processed at double rate. So in theory, you are getting a doubling of performance there. But you are limited, obviously, to 16-bit precision. But at the same time, it's great that this hardware feature of the Pro is being used because it hasn't had massive take-up.
Yeah, we've seen it in a few games so far, but it's not something that you should technically see looking closely at the game, because it's the point is to use it on shaders where it doesn't ruin the quality, right? Here, there's not a significant visual difference in any way that says, okay, well, this is using FP16, this is not. But that doesn't mean that there haven't been some other improvements. For instance, volumetric lighting, which is used heavily throughout the game, is rendered with a higher precision on the PS4 Pro. I think they said it's like 240 by 135 by 64, and the base system is like 192 by 108 by 64. And that's sort of a three-dimensional volume grid that they're talking about there. I suppose if you look really closely, you could probably see a very subtle difference, but during normal play, it's almost impossible to detect any difference. But to be fair, it's a very heavily post-processed game with a lot of focus on depth of field and very soft edges. The temporal AA solution is really aggressive, but it looks great. I think the idea here was to simulate the look of a camera, so to speak. So when you're comparing the two versions in most scenes, it kind of feels like you're looking at, say, 1080p Blu-ray versus a UHD Blu-ray, where it's more like examining film stock rather than actual rendering within a real-time game.
Yeah, I think this is something we need to discuss, because when you look at a traditional video game and the increase in picture quality that you get from increased resolution, there's like a night and day difference. You see like geometric edges being sharper, cleaner, but this is not the aesthetic look that Quantic Dream have gone for. They've gone, as you say, for this kind of virtual camera within their virtual world, which, again, mimics the properties of an actual camera and an actual lens. So, when you're taking your photos, resolution isn't the primary kind of indicator of picture quality, really, is it? It's all down to the quality of the overall scene and all of those post-process effects and how they marry up together.
Yeah, there was this kind of calls to mind a presentation that we looked at back at the beginning of this generation. We sort of discussed it in relation to Rise, if you remember.
Yeah.
But the idea was that just pushing the pixel count up alone wasn't necessarily going to lead to increased fidelity. Now, obviously, that does help, but it feels like Detroit is one of the games that subscribes to that original theory. You know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. I think the point is that, if you look at a Blu-ray and compare it to a DVD, neither of them are actually resolving what would be considered as a native 1080p as such. But obviously the increase in resolution on a Blu-ray does give you a cleaner, crisper image overall. And in this case, I think you're right. The comparison here really is between Blu-ray and a UHD Blu-ray. It really is kind of just that extra little bit of crispness and precision. But it's not the defining characteristic of the presentation.
That's right, exactly. So yeah, it's really interesting then to look at what sort of rendering that Quantic Dream has gone with here. And I guess as my original piece kind of pitched was, this is kind of what you get when you target a smaller scale. And, since like every other game that they've ever done, they've sort of rewrote the engine from the ground up specifically for this game. So the Quantic Dream games always kind of have a very different look from a lot of other titles on the market. And I feel like this is the one that really pushes the boundaries the furthest in terms of refinements to effects. And it's almost triggered some interesting discussions between, how does Detroit compare to that original 2012's Watch Dogs demo and such. And, so it really got me thinking about, how rendering has changed since then and what kind of advancements have been introduced here. For me, it's like the representation of digital actors is perhaps the most impressive aspect. The way light filters across the skin and the use of performance capture combined with that, and then of course the excellent depth of field behind the characters. Like everything kind of comes together to create something that at times you really get the sense that you're looking at something that's almost real, but not quite.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really impressed with it, and I really enjoyed the game, and I kind of feel almost that Quantic Dream were almost kind of subverting their own formula with the flowchart system, which is, essentially showing you what is happening under the hood of the game in every scenario. And it's tempting you to explore all of those different possibilities, whereas in previous titles you probably wouldn't have done that. And it's kind of weird in a way that they've gone for that approach. But when you are focusing so much developmental effort into what are, as you say, relatively small spaces, you want to get the value from it, and it kind of works out in that scenario, I think.
Yeah, I agree. The flowchart stuff is really fascinating, especially later in the game, as the flowchart itself really explodes. I mean, it's huge, and you can see so many different branches that could happen. I think that this is the first time that they've managed to really capitalize on those original concepts of a branching story. Because in the previous titles, it always kind of felt like the decisions you made were ultimately somewhat meaningless. You could fail entire chase sequences. You could, make choices that would, influence maybe the next piece of dialogue, but it rarely had a significant impact on the scenes that you would see. But here, it does actually. There was a few moments in my playthrough where something happened that completely changed where the game went from that point.
Interesting. And I think the other thing is I like the way that the flowchart system marries in with the concept that you are an AI and you are sort of studying probable outcomes, cause and effect, that kind of thing. You couldn't use the flowchart system in prior Quantic Dream games because it just wouldn't have sat within those particular concepts. But it kind of works here, I feel.
Yeah, it's an extension of what was done in Until Dawn, actually, which has been an interesting comparison point because up until now, I'd say Until Dawn was the best looking game of this style, which is to say it's essentially an evolution of the point-and-click adventure with less focus on puzzle and more on like dialogue and choices and things like that. But this is probably the most polished and complete take on that formula I've seen yet in that sense. I mean, regardless of how, people may feel about the story being told, the way it's presented and the options you're given and how they're able to show below the surface in that sense, plus the excellent presentation, it just makes for sort of an engaging and curious sort of experience. But yes, I think that kind of covers all of the bases worth talking about with Detroit that we hadn't covered already. It's a great looking game. It looks impressive on both PlayStation consoles, but the performance is still a little rough on the base system. But still, it looks fantastic. If you're looking for a technical demo to really showcase what can be done on a console with a decent sized budget and a very talented art team, this is worth checking out.
Yeah, definitely. And I also think if you have played Quantic Dream games before and you've kind of been put off by them, from my perspective, I never really went back to them after Heavy Rain. But this was actually just a great game to play as well.
Yeah, there's just a lot more to interact with and do in most scenes. And because there's that flowchart system, it sort of gives you a better idea of what you're doing and how it impacts the game, especially because you can look at the flowchart at any time during your game session. So you can sort of plan around and sort of mess with the underlying narrative in a really fun way. But anyways, I think that will do it for now. Thanks for joining me, Rich.
No problem at all.
And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that little bell up there in the corner, as it does help out the channel. And if you have any questions or comments, be sure to reach out to us on Twitter. And until next time, this is John and Rich signing off.